You're a mistake, he told her coldly. 6 years later, she stepped onto his yacht with a blonde son who had his eyes. The office was filled with the muted glow of early morning sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows, glinting off the polished steel fixtures and the flawless sheen of the mahogany desk. Edward Hayes stood near the window, his posture rigid, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his crisp navy suit and armor that reflected his wealth and control. Behind him, the skyline stretched endlessly, a reminder of everything he had built and everything he believed he could never risk losing. Sarah stood near his desk, clutching the small white stick in her trembling hands, her heart hammering as though it might burst from her chest. Her blue eyes searched his face for something, compassion, acknowledgement, maybe even love, but what she found was a mask of cold calculation that left her breathless. She had rehearsed this moment for days, imagining different reactions, hoping for some version of the man she had once thought she knew. In her mind, he would step toward her, take her in his arms, and accept the truth with the same passion he once showed in private moments. Instead, as her voice cracked and the words spilled out, words that should have changed everything, he didn't move. He didn't even flinch. His gaze flicked briefly to the test she held out to him, and then his lips curled into a faint, derisive smile. "You're a mistake," he said, his tone flat, each word deliberate, designed to cut deep and leave no room for hope. The phrase struck her like a blade, stealing the air from her lungs. For a long moment she could only stare at him, her body frozen, her throat tightening as if it refused to release the cry clawing its way upward. "Edward," she whispered, her voice breaking, "this is your child. Our child." She extended the test toward him, as though the undeniable proof in her hand might reach him where words could not. He finally turned to face her fully, his piercing blue eyes like shards of ice, devoid of warmth. "No, Sarah," he said with chilling certainty, "it's not mine. It will never be mine. I don't want this, and I will not let it drag me down. Do you understand?" His voice rose slightly at the end, not out of passion but out of irritation, as though she were an employee who had made an unforgivable error rather than the woman who had once shared his bed and his whispered promises. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's chest heaved as tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. She wanted to scream at him, to force him to see the cruelty of his words, but no sound left her lips. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the test, and when she finally lowered her arm, it felt like lowering a piece of her shattered soul. Edward turned back toward the window, his attention already shifting, as if the matter had been resolved with finality. His reflection in the glass looked untouchable, proud, and heartless, a man who had chosen power over humanity. Sarah forced her feet to move, though every step toward the door felt heavier than the last. Her body shook with the effort of holding herself together, her heart screaming with betrayal. She reached the door, her hand hovering on the cool metal handle, and for a moment she allowed herself one last look back. Edward hadn't turned around. He stood with his hands in his pockets, gazing out at the city, his posture a declaration that he had already erased her from his life. The tears she had held back slipped free, hot against her cheeks, as she pulled the door open and stepped out into the sterile hallway. The echo of his words, "You're a mistake," followed her down the corridor, each repetition etching deeper into her heart. She pressed a hand to her stomach, her touch instinctively protective, and in that moment she made a silent vow. He might deny them, he might try to erase their existence, but she would not. She would carry this child, she would fight for this child, and she would never let Edward Hayes' cruelty define the life growing inside her. The apartment Sarah moved into was nothing more than a cramped one-bedroom tucked into a tired old building on the edge of the city, but it became the fragile fortress where she tried to piece her life back together. The walls were thin, the floorboards creaked with every step, and in winter the draft forced her to wear sweaters to bed, yet it was hers, and it was where she would raise her child. She sat alone at the small kitchen table night after night, bills spread out before her, the weight of her decisions pressing down like a storm cloud. The test that had once been torn from her hands was now replaced by doctor's notes and appointment cards, each one reminding her of the life she carried, a life that gave her strength even as it terrified her. She worked long hours at a local diner, the kind of place where the smell of fried food clung to her clothes and her feet ached by the end of every shift. The pay was barely enough to cover rent and groceries, and she often skipped meals so she could put a little extra away for the future. Her co-workers were kind but distant, they had their own struggles and didn't ask many questions. Customers came and went, leaving behind empty plates and crumpled bills, but not one of them saw the quiet war Sarah fought inside herself each day. Her body grew heavier with the passing months, her ankles swelling after hours of standing, yet she pressed on, unwilling to let exhaustion or loneliness break her resolve. At night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren wailing through the city. Fear gnawed at her constantly, fear of what would happen if she got sick, if she lost her job, if she couldn't provide for the child who was already more real to her than anything else in the world. Sometimes she buried her face in her pillow and cried until her chest ached, but she never allowed herself to give in completely. She would whisper softly to her unborn baby, her voice shaky but determined, promising love, safety, and a future she had no idea how to build. Those whispered promises became her anchor, a fragile thread pulling her through the darkest nights. Her parents lived far away, and she had not told them. The shame was too heavy, the thought of hearing their disappointment unbearable. Friends from her old life had faded too, drawn into their own relationships, their own ambitions, leaving Sarah to face her new reality in silence. Loneliness became her constant companion, a shadow that followed her through every step of the day. Yet, even in her solitude, she discovered a resilience she never knew she possessed. Each small kick she felt inside her reminded her that she was not truly alone, that her fight was not only for herself but for the tiny life that depended entirely on her. The first time she heard the baby's heartbeat, she broke down in the sterile white room of the clinic, tears streaming freely as she pressed her hands over her stomach. The sound was rapid, fragile, and yet impossibly strong, filling the space with proof that no rejection, no cruelty, no denial could erase this existence. She walked home that day through cold rain, soaked to the skin, but she carried within her a warmth she could not describe. That heartbeat became the rhythm of her days, echoing in her mind when exhaustion threatened to consume her, a reminder that the fight was worth it. Sarah's world had become smaller, her circle tighter, but her purpose grew larger with each passing day. She no longer measured her life in shifts and paychecks but in the quiet moments of connection with the child she had not yet met. Every ache, every sacrifice, every tear became part of the foundation she was laying for the future. Edward's words still haunted her, cutting deep into her memory, but they no longer defined her. She was determined to prove, if only to herself and to the life inside her, that what he had called a mistake would one day become her greatest triumph. The night Sarah went into labor was one she would never forget, a storm both inside and outside her body. The sky was heavy with dark clouds and rain lashed against the windows of her small apartment as she struggled to breathe through the first waves of pain. She clutched the edge of the worn kitchen table, her knuckles white, her legs trembling beneath her as another contraction tore through her. For a moment she thought she could manage on her own, but the intensity built so quickly that fear seized her chest. With shaking hands she called a cab, clutching her bag as she stumbled out into the wet night, the water soaking through her shoes, the city lights blurring in her vision as she fought the mounting agony. The hospital was a blur of harsh lights, urgent voices, and the beeping of machines. Nurses guided her quickly into a room, their words calm but insistent as they settled her into the bed and strapped monitors to her body. She felt small in the sterile environment, dwarfed by the chaos, yet within her was a strength she could not explain. Hours stretched on, each contraction sharper, more consuming, her body drenched in sweat as she cried out into the air. She gripped the rails of the bed until her arms ached, her throat raw from gasping and screaming. There were moments when she thought she could not go on, when the pain swallowed her whole and she begged for it to end, but each time she felt a faint movement inside her, a reminder of why she was fighting. When the final push came, she thought her body would shatter, but then she heard it, the fragile cry of new life piercing through the din. The sound was sharp, insistent, and so beautiful that tears filled her eyes instantly. The doctor announced that it was a boy, and moments later a tiny, wrinkled bundle was placed in her trembling arms. Sarah stared down at him, her chest heaving, her tears falling onto his soft blonde hair. His little fists clenched, his cry echoing in the room, and when his eyes opened for the first time, she was struck speechless. They were the same piercing blue as Edward's, a mirror that brought back all the pain, but in this moment those eyes belonged to her son alone. She whispered his name, Nathan, as though it was a prayer, her lips trembling as she spoke it again and again until it became real. The name felt right, solid and strong, as though it would carry him forward through a world that would not always be kind. Holding him against her chest, she felt the rhythm of his tiny heartbeat, fast and determined, and for the first time since Edward had cast her out, she felt whole again. The exhaustion of the labor weighed on her like a heavy blanket, but the warmth of Nathan's body gave her the strength to remain awake, to memorize every detail of his face, the softness of his skin, the faint scent of new life that clung to him. As the room quieted, the machines steady and the nurses stepping back to give her space, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. She brushed a finger over Nathan's cheek, marveling at the miracle in her arms. All the loneliness, the hunger, the exhaustion of the past months melted into insignificance in the presence of this child. He was proof that she had endured, that she had chosen love over despair. She bent her head, pressing her lips gently to his forehead, and whispered promises she intended to keep for the rest of her life. She promised he would never feel unwanted, never know the sting of rejection, never believe he was a mistake. The storm outside still raged, the rain hammering against the hospital windows, but Sarah no longer felt afraid. In her arms she held not just her son but her future, a light that burned brighter than the darkness that had chased her for so long. As she drifted into an exhausted sleep, Nathan nestled against her. She knew with absolute certainty that whatever hardships lay ahead, she would face them all. For him, she would survive anything. Edward Hayes had spent the last 6 years building an empire larger than even he had once dreamed, yet every new success left him emptier than the one before. His blonde hair, immaculately styled for every magazine feature, and his sharp blue eyes made him the picture of control, but behind the veneer was a man who could not find peace in anything he owned. His penthouse was lined with art and glass, the floors gleaming, the rooms filled with everything a man of his wealth could desire, yet the silence at night was deafening. He attended parties where champagne never stopped flowing and women in glittering gowns hung on his arm, but when the night ended and the lights dimmed, he always returned to an apartment that felt colder than ice. The acquisition of his yacht had been his latest indulgence, a sprawling vessel worth millions, outfitted with marble counters, private cabins, and a crew trained to anticipate his every whim. To the world it was another symbol of his power, a floating palace where he could entertain clients or lovers, where he could remind everyone that he was a man above all others. But for Edward, the yacht was little more than another distraction, something he hoped might fill the hollow space inside him. He invited women aboard, poured them wine, and laughed at their jokes, but he always found himself staring past them, into the horizon, with a gnawing sense that he was chasing something he could never catch. He told himself that loneliness was the price of greatness. He convinced himself that sacrifices had to be made, that emotions only made men weak. Yet sometimes, late at night when the city outside his window was quiet and he could no longer bury himself in work, he heard the echo of his own words spoken years ago, "You're a mistake." The phrase drifted back unbidden, carrying with it a sharp pang that he tried to drown in liquor and business meetings. He never allowed himself to linger on what those words had cost, refusing to admit that somewhere out there might be a child with his eyes, a child whose existence he had refused to acknowledge. Meanwhile, Sarah was living in a very different world, raising Nathan in a modest apartment with creaking steps and peeling paint. Edward never knew of the boy's laughter echoing through small rooms, of his endless questions about the world, of the way his blonde hair caught the light in the sun and his blue eyes, Edward's eyes, sparkled with curiosity. Nathan had grown into a bright, joyful child who adored stories and was fascinated by the sea, though he had never known the father whose blood ran in his veins. Sarah shielded him from the truth as best she could, giving him love enough for two, though in the quiet of the night she sometimes wondered how long she could keep the truth hidden. As Edward entertained investors on his yacht, showing off the gleaming decks and the luxury hidden within, he could not know how close his world was to colliding with the past he had tried so hard to erase. He had convinced himself that his choices were final, that he had severed all ties with what once was. But fate had other plans, and soon the sea that brought him so many hollow nights of indulgence would bring back the one thing he had cast aside, the woman he had broken and the son he had never known. The summer morning was warm, the sky painted in a brilliant shade of blue that seemed to promise a day of peace. Sarah woke early, as she always did, moving quietly around the apartment so as not to disturb Nathan's sleep. She stood for a long time at the window, her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, watching her son stir beneath the thin blanket on the couch they shared. At 5 years old, Nathan was already full of energy and curiosity, his blonde hair tousled, his blue eyes sparkling whenever he discovered something new. That morning, she wanted to give him something special, something beyond the routine of cramped walls and city streets. When her friend called with an unexpected opportunity to help on a yacht for the day, Sarah hesitated only briefly before agreeing. The pay would be modest, but the thought of showing Nathan the sea filled her with excitement. She packed his small bag with care, tucking in his favorite toy car and a sandwich, telling herself that this would be a memory he could hold on to. When they arrived at the dock, Nathan's eyes widened at the sight of the vast expanse of water. His small hand gripped hers tightly as he stared at the yacht rising before them, gleaming in the sunlight like something out of a dream. To him it looked like a castle on the sea, and his mouth opened in wonder as he whispered, "Mom, it's huge." Sarah smiled at his awe, though her chest tightened with nerves. She had no idea who owned the vessel, only that her friend had vouched for her skills in the kitchen and promised the work would be easy. She reminded herself that it was just one day, one chance to let Nathan see a world bigger than their little apartment, and she forced her anxiety down as they boarded. The crew greeted her with polite nods, showing her the galley where she would spend most of her time preparing simple meals and helping with service. Nathan was allowed to sit quietly in the corner, sketching in his coloring book as he often did when she worked. He sat cross-legged, his blonde head bent low, while Sarah tied on the apron they had provided and tried to focus on her tasks. Yet every so often she glanced toward the deck through the narrow kitchen window, marveling at the horizon stretching endlessly, the waves shimmering under the sun. She thought of how much Nathan would love to stand there, the sea breeze in his hair, his laughter carrying over the water. The first few hours passed without incident. Sarah chopped vegetables, washed dishes, and followed the chef's instructions while Nathan nibbled on the sandwich she had packed. The galley smelled of roasted garlic and fresh herbs, the sounds of sizzling pans filling the air. For a brief time she allowed herself to feel almost normal, almost as if this were just another job, not the strange, glittering world of wealth she had always avoided. She told herself she would finish the day, collect her pay, and walk away with Nathan, both of them carrying the memory of the ocean in their hearts. But fate never let her escape so easily. Late in the afternoon, voices rose outside the galley, deeper and sharper than those of the crew. A presence moved across the deck with the kind of authority that silenced conversations, and Sarah froze, her knife halting mid-chop. She heard footsteps approaching, the sound of laughter that was both familiar and jarring. Her heart lurched violently as she pressed her palms to the counter to steady herself, though she did not yet see him. Nathan, oblivious, had wandered closer to the doorway, his coloring book in hand. He leaned forward, his blue eyes wide with curiosity as he caught sight of the man stepping onto the deck. Sarah followed her son's gaze, and when her eyes fell on the tall figure with sunlit blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, her breath caught in her throat. Edward Hayes stood not 10 feet away, his tailored white shirt crisp against his tanned skin, his confident stride commanding the space as if the yacht itself were his throne. Sarah's body stiffened, her stomach twisting as though the ground beneath her had disappeared. She had spent years building a life without him, raising Nathan in the shadow of his absence, and now here he was, as sharp and imposing as the day he had cast her aside. Her first instinct was to pull Nathan away, to shield him from Edward's gaze, but it was too late. Nathan had already stepped into the doorway, sunlight catching the blonde in his hair, his blue eyes, Edward's eyes, staring curiously at the stranger before him. In that single moment, Sarah knew the fragile wall she had built around her life was about to collapse. The past she had fought so hard to bury had risen again, and it had found her here, on the sea, with her son at her side. Edward froze when his eyes landed on the small figure in the doorway. The boy could not have been more than 5 years old, his blonde hair catching the sunlight in the exact shade Edward saw in the mirror each morning, his blue eyes wide and innocent, yet so piercingly familiar that they sent a shock down his spine. For a moment the bustling sounds of the yacht disappeared, the clinking of glasses, the chatter of guests, the steady hum of the engines, and all that remained was the boy's gaze locking with his. Edward's chest tightened, his throat suddenly dry, as if his body already knew the truth before his mind could process it. He staggered inwardly, though outwardly he forced himself to stand tall, his posture betraying only the faintest hesitation. Sarah appeared instantly, her movements quick and protective, pulling Nathan back against her side as if she could shield him with the strength of her body alone. Her blue eyes, those same eyes that once looked at him with love, were now sharp with warning. She held herself rigid, every line of her posture screaming that she would not allow him near. Edward's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in years, he found himself speechless, robbed of the commanding voice that had once bent boardrooms and politicians to his will. He had built an empire, silenced opponents, conquered every challenge that dared stand before him, yet now he stood powerless before the sight of a child who carried his face. The silence stretched unbearably, thick and suffocating. Nathan looked up at Sarah with curiosity, tugging gently at her apron. "Mom, who's that man?" he asked in a small voice, his innocence cutting through the tension like a blade. Sarah tightened her grip, her hand trembling only slightly as she smoothed his hair. "No one important," she said, her words sharp, directed at Edward more than at her son. Her tone was laced with bitterness, every syllable meant to remind him of what he had abandoned. Edward took a step closer, unable to stop himself, though the weight in Sarah's gaze warned him to keep his distance. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, hoarse, stripped of the authority he usually carried. "Is he?" His eyes flicked to the boy and back again, desperate for confirmation even as the truth screamed in every detail of Nathan's face. Sarah's expression hardened, her jaw tightening, her anger burning through her exhaustion. "Yes," she said, her voice calm but cutting, each word precise. "This is Nathan. Your son. The child you called a mistake." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her voice did not break. She had cried enough years ago, now she spoke with the steel of a woman who had raised a child alone. The word struck Edward harder than any blow he had ever endured. His chest constricted, his stomach turned, and for a moment he felt as though the deck beneath him might give way. He remembered that day in his office, the look on Sarah's face as he dismissed her, the cold certainty in his own voice as he told her she meant nothing. The memory collided with the sight of Nathan, living proof of the life he had rejected, and the weight of his cruelty settled on him like lead. Nathan looked between them, confusion flickering across his face as he tried to understand. "Mom, what does he mean?" he asked softly, but Sarah knelt and brushed his cheek, whispering something meant only for him. Edward could not hear the words, but the tenderness in her tone sliced him open. She had carried everything, every hardship, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, without him, and she had done it with love. For the first time in his adult life, Edward felt small. He wanted to speak, to say he had been wrong, to beg for forgiveness, but the words tangled in his throat. Sarah rose again, standing tall before him, her body positioned like a barrier between him and the boy. "You don't get to walk back into his life just because you finally saw what you chose to ignore," she said quietly, but with the force of a sentence. "You had your chance, and you threw it away." Edward's eyes burned, though no tears fell. His hands curled at his sides, not in anger but in helplessness. He had faced hostile takeovers and ruthless enemies, yet nothing had ever left him feeling as defeated as this moment. He opened his mouth, desperate to say something, anything, but the only words that emerged were broken and thin. "I was wrong." Sarah's gaze did not soften. She shook her head slightly, her voice steady and unyielding. "Wrong doesn't undo 5 years. Wrong doesn't give him back the father he never had." She pulled Nathan closer, and the boy leaned into her, still watching Edward with wide, searching eyes. That look haunted him as he stood there, rooted in place, a man who had everything yet realized in an instant he had nothing. The yacht around him gleamed with luxury, the sea stretched endlessly beyond, but Edward had never felt more trapped, more empty, more desperate. When Sarah finally turned away, guiding Nathan back into the galley, Edward remained standing on the deck, staring after them with his heart pounding. The sound of his son's small voice echoed in his mind, a voice filled with questions he had no right to answer. He had built his life on power and denial, but standing there, watching the woman he had broken walk away with the boy who carried his eyes, Edward Hayes felt the crushing truth: he had been the mistake all along. That night Edward sat alone in his penthouse, the city glowing beneath him like a field of stars, but the sight only deepened the hollowness inside his chest. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, then another, but no amount of alcohol could drown out the memory of Nathan's eyes staring back at him on the deck of the yacht. Those eyes had stripped away every shield he had built over the years, every illusion of control and invincibility, leaving him raw and shaken in a way he could not explain. He thought of Sarah's voice, steady and unyielding as she named him the father of the child he had once dismissed. The words circled endlessly in his mind, a relentless reminder of the life he had rejected and the years he could never reclaim. For the first time in his adult life, Edward found himself questioning everything he had built. The empire that had once defined him now felt meaningless, its towers of glass and steel nothing compared to the weight of his own failures. He tried to focus on contracts, meetings, and deals, but each page blurred until all he could see was a little boy's blonde hair and the curve of his curious smile. At night he tossed in bed, the echo of Sarah's bitterness chasing him into restless dreams where he reached for Nathan but always found himself too late. When Julia, the woman who had been his companion in recent months, noticed his distraction, she demanded answers. Over dinner she pressed him, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming impatiently on the table, her sharp blue eyes narrowed in irritation. At last Edward told her the truth, his voice rough as he admitted that he had a son, that he had abandoned him, and that he had seen him for the first time only days ago. Julia's expression turned cold. She pulled her hand back, her lips tightening with disdain, and she made it clear that she had no interest in being tied to a man with a hidden child from his past. That night she left his apartment without looking back, and Edward did not try to stop her. Strangely, her departure did not wound him the way it might have before. Instead, it left him facing the silence of his home with a clarity he had long avoided. He realized then that all the women, the wealth, and the distractions had been nothing more than flimsy masks to cover the truth. He had been running for years, pretending he could live without responsibility, without love, without the consequences of his choices. But Nathan's face had shattered that illusion forever. The following days were filled with a restlessness that Edward could not shake. He drove past Sarah's neighborhood more than once, parking at a distance, his chest tightening when he caught sight of her walking Nathan to school. He watched from afar as the boy skipped along the sidewalk, his small backpack bouncing, his laughter carrying even across the street. Sarah's hand never left his shoulder, guiding him gently, her face tired but filled with a quiet strength. Edward stayed hidden, afraid to approach, afraid to intrude, but also unable to turn away. Each glimpse tore at him, yet it also strengthened his resolve. He had missed 5 years, years he could never give back, but perhaps he could give something now, if Sarah would allow it. Finally, after nights of torment and indecision, he knocked on her door. His heart pounded as he stood in the dim hallway of her building, a place far removed from the polished lobbies and marble floors he was used to. When Sarah opened the door, her face betrayed no surprise, as if she had expected him sooner or later. Her expression was guarded, her arms crossed, her blue eyes sharp and cautious. Edward swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I need to talk," he said, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "Please." Nathan peeked from behind her legs, his small hand gripping the fabric of her jeans. His wide eyes met Edward's, filled with curiosity but also uncertainty, as though sensing the tension he could not yet understand. Edward felt his chest tighten painfully, guilt pressing down on him until he could hardly breathe. He looked at Sarah, desperate. "I can't change the past," he said softly, "but I want to try now. I want to know him. I want to be his father, if you'll let me." Sarah's expression did not waver. Her voice was calm but firm, each word weighted with the strength of a woman who had carried everything alone. "Words are easy, Edward. Promises are easy. You weren't there for the sleepless nights, for the doctor's visits, for the days when I thought I couldn't go on. You weren't there when he asked about his father and I had nothing to tell him. You left us both before he even took his first breath." She looked down briefly at Nathan, then back at him. "If you want to be part of his life, you'll have to prove it. Not to me, but to him. You don't get to erase the past with a single apology." Edward nodded, the weight of her words heavy but deserved. For once, he did not argue, did not try to bend her to his will. He understood that she was right. Redemption would not come in one night, nor in 1,000 apologies, but only in the quiet persistence of showing up, of being present, of giving what he had once denied. As he left her doorway that evening, Nathan's eyes followed him, wide and thoughtful, and Edward knew that whatever it took, however long it required, he would not walk away again. For the first time in years, he carried with him not the emptiness of wealth but the fragile spark of hope for a different kind of future. The weeks that followed were a slow unfolding of something Edward had never known before, a life built not on power or wealth but on patience, humility, and the fragile bonds of family. At first, his presence was awkward. Nathan would look at him with wide, questioning eyes, unsure whether to treat him as a stranger or something more, and Sarah would watch every movement with the sharp attention of a guardian unwilling to let him cause another wound. Edward did not try to force his way in, he showed up quietly, offering to walk Nathan to school, to help with errands, to sit on the floor and build towers out of blocks that always toppled before they were finished. The boys' laughter when the blocks crashed into a heap filled the small apartment in a way Edward had never experienced, louder and warmer than any applause he had ever received in his boardrooms. Sarah remained cautious. She stood in the background during those first visits, arms crossed, ready to intervene if needed, but as she watched Edward stumble through bedtime stories, mispronouncing words while Nathan giggled and corrected him, she began to see something shift. This was not the man who had once turned his back on them with ice in his voice. This was a man trying, failing sometimes, but returning again and again with a persistence that could not be feigned. She still carried her anger, the memories of nights spent alone while Nathan cried, the endless exhaustion of raising a child without support, but she could not ignore the evidence that Edward was slowly changing. Edward's own world transformed in quiet but profound ways. He cancelled late-night meetings, handed responsibilities to others he had once hoarded out of fear of losing control, and began leaving the office early to spend evenings in Sarah's small apartment. The penthouse no longer felt like home, its polished silence unbearable compared to the sound of Nathan's voice asking him to play one more round of a game or tell one more story before bed. He even learned to cook simple meals, fumbling with recipes until Nathan proudly declared the burnt pancakes perfect, and Sarah, despite herself, smiled faintly at the sight. For a man who had once measured his worth by numbers and headlines, he began to measure it now by the moments when Nathan slipped his small hand into his without hesitation. One evening, after Nathan had finally fallen asleep, Edward lingered at the kitchen table while Sarah washed dishes. The hum of the refrigerator and the quiet rush of water filled the silence between them. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his voice low when he finally spoke. "I know I can never give back the years I stole from you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm not leaving again. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll prove it to both of you." His words trembled with a vulnerability Sarah had never heard in him before. She set down the dishcloth and turned to face him, her expression torn between the old bitterness and something softer. For a long moment she said nothing, studying the man who had once broken her and was now asking to rebuild something new. At last she exhaled, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't know if I can forget what you did, Edward. But maybe I can learn to forgive. For his sake. For mine." The admission cost her something, and he saw it in the flicker of her eyes, but it also opened a door neither of them had dared to imagine before. Edward reached across the table slowly, almost afraid she would pull away, but when her hand met his, the warmth of her touch spread through him like sunlight. It was not the triumphant victory he had once sought in his business conquests. It was something far rarer, the fragile beginning of trust, of hope, of a second chance. He lowered his head, overwhelmed by the enormity of it, and for the first time since he had been a young man, tears gathered in his eyes. The weeks turned into months, and the bond between father and son deepened. Edward took Nathan to the park, pushed him on swings, taught him how to skip stones across the water. He sat at the small kitchen table helping with letters and numbers, fumbling through homework with the same determination he once brought to financial reports. Sarah, though still cautious, began to watch with less suspicion and more quiet acceptance. The weight of years did not disappear overnight, but the cracks in her armor began to show, and behind them was the woman she had once been, the woman who still wanted to believe in love. One evening, as the three of them stood on the balcony of the yacht that had once symbolized only Edward's arrogance, the setting sun painted the water in gold. Nathan held both their hands, his laughter carried by the breeze as he pointed out shapes in the clouds. Edward looked at Sarah, the light softening her features, and spoke words he had once thought he would never be able to say. "You were right to fight for him. I was wrong in every way that mattered. But if you'll let me, I want to fight now, for both of you." Sarah met his gaze, her blue eyes filled with a mixture of pain, history, and something new. She did not answer immediately, but she didn't let go of his hand either. In that silence, filled with the sound of the waves and their son's laughter, something fragile but unbreakable took root. It was not the naive love they had once shared, but something stronger, forged in suffering, shaped by resilience, and given life by the boy who had unknowingly brought them back together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah knew the road ahead would not be simple. But standing there with Edward and Nathan beside her, she allowed herself for the first time in years to believe in the possibility of healing. And Edward, humbled and transformed, knew that this was the only future worth fighting for.